Good evening. Welcome. On behalf of the Board of Directors of Thoreau Farm and the Thoreau Society, we are glad that you could join us tonight. I'm Margaret Carol Bergman, Executive Director of Thoreau Farm. Hopefully, many of you will recognize this room. And if not, I'm speaking to you from the room where Henry was born, in the most estimable place in all the world, and in the very nick of time, too. Tonight's talk, Stark Mad Abolitionists, Concord, and the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, kicks off the second year of The Right Connection, a series of author talks and writing workshops sponsored by Thoreau Farm, the Thoreau Society, and by a generous gift from Marjorie Merritt Carmen. Before we get to our guest, Richard Smith, I want to mention we have a few exciting programs being offered this fall. 24 hours of climate reality with two of Vice President Al Gore's climate reality leaders, myself and Keith Bergman, on October 10th. We'll be talking for an hour, tops. A panel discussion on Concord's famous transcendentalists and how they set the stage for today's social justice activists. Historians Richard Smith, Nikki Turpin, Beth Van Duzer, and Tammy Rose will be representing The Right Connection. The panel will be hosted by the Nancy R. Chandler Speaker Series at Central Oregon Community College, and that will be on October 15th. Arctic explorer Lawrence Millman will join us on October 18th to discuss his new book, Goodbye Ice. We'll also be holding fiction, journal, and memoir writing and publishing workshops throughout the fall. Go to thethoreaufarm.org for more information. A bit of housekeeping, or more of a confession. This is Thoreau Farm's maiden voyage with the Zoom webinar format. You'll be able, and you are encouraged, to send your questions to me via chat throughout the talk. I have not salted tonight's program with prepared questions, so we are relying on you. We'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. There might be a few glitches, so please bear with me. Tonight's program will run 1 hour. Hopefully, we won't cut anyone off. And now for tonight's guest. I first saw Richard Smith on a hot July day at Walden Pond about 11 years ago. He was fully dressed in mid-19th century costume, encircled by adults and children alike who were captivated to meet a living representation of Henry. When I later started my current position at Thoreau Farm, I was thrilled to learn that Richard Smith was one of the docents for the birthplace. He was also an employee of the Thoreau Society. He soon became a friend and a great resource, not only on all things Henry Thoreau, but on Bronson Alcott, the Civil War, John Brown, and Concord history. The list goes on. He was an early contributor to Thoreau Farm's book of essays for the Thoreau Bicentennial, What Would Henry Do? He has since written or edited 5 or is it 6 books for Applewood Press. He is a wonderful and knowledgeable colleague, and like so many in the Thoreau world, Richard is always ready and willing to help with any project to educate people about Henry Thoreau, his work, and his legacy. So tonight, broadcasting from the Thoreau Society's bookstore at Walden Pond, I give you Richard Smith.
Thank you, Margaret. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to everybody who's watching from all over the country, I guess. Yes, I'm coming to you live from the shop at Walden Pond run by the Thoreau Society, because basically the lighting here is much better than in my kitchen. And I'd like to thank first Margaret for having me here. I'd also like to thank Mike Frederick of the Thoreau Society for allowing me to use the shop after hours. And I'd like to thank Pete Hoffman of Massachusetts DCR, Walden Pond State Reservation, for allowing me to be here as well. So let's get started. In 1837, the Female Anti-Slavery Society was established in Concord, Massachusetts at the home of Mrs. Samuel Barrett. Mary Merrick Brooks became a key member of the society, and the membership included Mrs. Cynthia Dunbar Thoreau, her daughters Helen and Sophia, Mrs. Minot Pratt, Mrs. Lydian Emerson and her daughter Ellen, Mrs. Lucy Brown, and Mrs. Abigail Alcott. Also among the founders of the society was Susan Garrison. Her membership is notable because she was the lone woman of color listed in the existing society records. Over the next 2.5 decades, the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society would be front and center in the fight against slavery, and it became one of the best known societies in the country. But while these women and many men were involved in the anti-slavery battle, Concord itself was not necessarily considered an abolitionist town. In fact, anti-slavery lectures at the Concord Lyceum were frowned upon. And throughout the 1830s and 1840s, abolitionism was very much on the fringe of society. Out of a population of 2,000, perhaps only a few dozen Concordians would have considered themselves abolitionists. But this all changed in 1850 with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. But first, back to 1776. From the very beginning of our country's creation, the issue of slavery was a problem that plagued the founding fathers and the succeeding generation of Americans. Indeed, many of the colonists who sought freedom from British tyranny themselves bought and sold human beings. By underpinning the colonial economy with the brutal institution of chattel slavery, the early patriots deprived roughly 1/5 of the American population of their own inalienable rights to liberty. In his initial draft of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, who of course himself was a slaveholder, blamed Britain's King George for his role in creating and perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade, which Jefferson described in so many words as a crime against humanity, calling slavery piratical warfare, execrable commerce, and an assemblage of horrors. Yet when the final draft of the Declaration was agreed upon, the passage about slavery was gone. Why? Well, it seems that as the yet unborn nation was already divided along sectional lines, Southern colonies, particularly slave-dependent Georgia and South Carolina, objected to the passage. If Jefferson, John Adams, and others wanted to see the Declaration unanimously adopted by all 60 members of the Continental Congress, compromise over the passage and concessions to slavery itself needed to be made. That's why slavery is ignored in the Declaration of Independence. When the Constitutional Convention gathered in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation in 1787, there were several issues on the agenda, with the major issue being slavery. Though the word slavery does not appear anywhere in the Constitution, the issue was central to the debates over commerce and congressional representation. The so-called 3/5 compromise provided that 3/5, 60% of enslaved people in each state would count towards congressional representation, thus increasing the number of Southern seats in Congress. In return for this concession, Southern states agreed to stop importing enslaved people from Africa in 1808. As a result, Congress assumed the power to regulate the commercial aspects of slavery. As a result, slavery grew and expanded in the South, but it died out or became illegal in the North. And so compromise and concession over slavery would continue well into the 19th century. As the nation grew and new states were added, political leaders did their best to strike a balance so as not to create any sectional tension over the issue. If a new state entered the Union as a free state, a slave state would be created to keep the balance of Senate power even. For instance, with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the entrance of slaveholding Missouri was balanced by the creation of Maine. There were now 24, as I call them, not so united states, 12 slave and 12 free. But the Union was saved for the time being. The 1840s saw a rapid increase in new territories beyond the Mississippi River. Westward expansion, dubbed Manifest Destiny, was in full swing. the Mexican-American War, 1845 to 1846, and the discovery of gold in California in 1848 led to mass emigration into these unclaimed territories, unclaimed, ignoring the fact that tens of thousands of Native Americans already lived there. Texas entered the Union as a slave state in 1845, while Wisconsin came in as a free state in 1848. We were now at 15 slave and 15 free states, which finally brings us to the Compromise of 1850. After gold was discovered in California in 1848, almost 300,000 fortune seekers had flocked to the territory in the hopes of striking it rich. Many did not find their fortune in California, but many stayed there to make their living in one way or another. On September 9th, 1850, as part of the Compromise of 1850, California was admitted to the Union as a free state, the 31st state, thus permanently denying the expansion of slavery on the Pacific coast. But with the creation of a new state arose the old issue of sectional power. Neither the free states nor the slave states wanted to feel as if the other side was in control of the Senate. Which section was going to control the country, the slaveholding South or the free North? Congress now had to deal with the slavery issue in a very real way. Enter Whig Senator Henry Clay and Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas. Together they crafted the legislation that became known as the Compromise of 1850. Simply put, it was a package of 5 separate bills that would hopefully diffuse the ongoing political confrontation between slave and free states on the status of territories acquired in the Mexican War. It also set Texas's western and northern boundaries and included provisions addressing fugitive slaves and the slave trade. And it was the Compromise's Fugitive Slave Bill that garnered the most attention in the North. The measure strengthened the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, which granted jurisdiction to all state and federal judges over cases regarding fugitive slaves. However, several northern states, including Massachusetts, dissatisfied by the lack of due process in these cases, passed personal liberty laws that made it more difficult to return alleged fugitives to the South. In other words, many northern states simply ignored the Fugitive Slave Law. But the new Fugitive Slave Law penalized officials who did not arrest an alleged runaway slave and made them liable to a fine of $1,000, which is about $31,000 in today's value. Law enforcement officials everywhere were now required by law to arrest people suspected of being a runaway slave on even the flimsiest evidence, such as a claimant's sworn testimony of ownership. Slave owners needed only to supply an affidavit to a federal marshal in order to capture what he called an escaped slave. Now, here's the worst part. The suspected slave had no rights in the matter whatsoever. He or she could not ask for a jury trial or even testify in his or her own behalf. Since a suspected slave was not eligible to ask for trial, the new law often resulted in the kidnapping and conscription of free blacks into slavery. Suspected fugitive slaves had no rights in court and could not defend themselves against the accusations of being a runaway. The new Fugitive Slave Law now demanded that all U.S. citizens return alleged fugitive slaves to their masters or face fines or imprisonment. Any person aiding or abetting a runaway slave by providing food or shelter or getting them to Canada was subject to 6 months imprisonment and a $1,000 fine. On the other hand, officers who captured a fugitive slave were entitled to a bonus or a promotion for their work. Judges who decided in favor of slaveholders reclaiming their property got a bigger bonus than if they decided in favor of the runaway. The 5 bills making up the Compromise of 1850 were passed by Congress on September 18th, 1850, 170 years ago today, and signed into law by President Millard Fillmore. Some mostly the Southerners, naively believed that the Compromise of 1850 had solved the slavery issue once and for all. But in fact, it now polarized the country between North and South even worse. The Compromise in general, and the Fugitive Slave Law in particular, were met with violent protest across the country. Many Northerners viewed the law as evidence that the South was protecting slavery through federal coercion and force, regardless of the will of Northern voters. This led to mass protests by many Northerners who believed that the influence of the slave power, or the slaveocracy as they called it, on the federal government was now overwhelming and one-sided. And a number of altercations, many violent, took place in northern cities between Southern slave catchers and Northern abolitionists throughout the 1850s. Because of the new law, cities like Boston and Worcester began to utilize vigilante justice as an avenue of resistance against slave catchers, calling themselves vigilance committees. Militant abolitionism led to fugitives being rescued, armed patrols in the streets keeping an eye out for slave catchers, and the harassment of federal marshals who arrested slaves. Suddenly, it seemed people who had little or no opinions about slavery were now not only protesting the Fugitive Slave Law, but slavery in general. As one wealthy Bostonian would later remember it, we went to bed one night, old-fashioned conservative compromise Union Whigs, and waked up stark mad abolitionists. Meanwhile, in Concord, Massachusetts, a town filled with famous personalities and radical reformers, the news of the Fugitive Slave Law was met with anger and dismay. It seems that almost everyone, from the famous to the not so famous, had something to say about it. The most famous man in town, of course, was Ralph Waldo Emerson. By 1850, he was known around the world, but it was that world fame that usually kept him from making public statements about political or social issues. Quote, "I do not often speak to public questions. They are odious and hurtful, and it seems like meddling or leaving your work. And then I see what havoc it makes with any good mind, and it becomes a dissipated philanthropy." But that had changed in 1844, when he gave his first anti-slavery address on the commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the English emancipation of slaves in the British West Indies. And by 1850, it was well known, at least in Concord, that Mr. Emerson had abolitionist tendencies. But the diehard abolitionist in the Emerson household was not Mr. Emerson. That honor went to his wife, Lydian Jackson Emerson. In fact, Waldo's recent transition to speaking out on slavery was in no small part due to Lydian's radicalism. Here was a woman who decorated her front gate in black crepe on the 4th of July as a sign of mourning for the almost 4 million enslaved. And she had a huge influence on her husband, the Sage of Concord, speaking out on slavery. As for the Fugitive Slave Law itself, Lydian called it, quote, "our national shame in standing on the neck of the enslaved black man." Waldo was, of course, appalled by the new law. He called it, quote, "a filthy enactment created in the 19th century by people who could read and write." And in his journal, Emerson would vow, "I will not obey it by God." The passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, I think it's safe to say, made Emerson from that day forward a committed abolitionist. And he would publicly speak out against the filthy enactment on May 3rd, 1851, when he would give an address to his fellow Concordians called the Fugitive Slave Law. And here's a passage from it. "But I put it to every noble and generous spirit, to every poetic, every heroic, every religious heart, that not so is our learning, our education, our poetry, our worship to be declared. Liberty is aggressive. Liberty is the crusade of all brave and conscientious men, the epic poetry, the new religion, the chivalry of all gentlemen. This is the oppressed lady whom true knights on their oath and honor must rescue and save. The Fugitive Slave Law did much to unglue the eyes of men. The Anti-Slavery Society will add many members this year. The Whig Party will join it. The Democrats will join it. The population of the free states will join it. I doubt not at last the slave states will join it. But be that sooner or later, and whoever comes or stays away, I hope we have reached the end of our unbelief, have come to a belief that there is a divine providence in the world. Now, of course, the Emersons were not the only ones in Concord who were fired up over the new law. While anti-slavery sentiment had not been popular even a few years before, the climate now changed in Concord. Bronson Alcott, himself a lifelong abolitionist, journalized in 1850, quote, "Even Wendell Phillips and William Lloyd Garrison are now listened to with some respect, and their doctrines and measures find favor from a very excellent body amongst us." To the Alcott family, the Fugitive Slave Law was a moot point. They'd been involved in the Underground Railroad for several years. Their home on Lexington Road that they called the Hillside sheltered one, possibly two runaway slaves in the winter of 1847. Bronson Alcott would write of one of the fugitives, quote, "His stay with us has given image and a name to the dire entity of slavery, and was an impressive lesson to my children, bringing before them the wrongs of the black man and his tales of woe." His wife, Abigail, was equally dedicated to the abolitionist cause. She came from a long line of abolitionists. She would also write about the fugitive slaves, saying, "We have had an interesting fugitive here for 2 weeks, right from Maryland. He was anxious to get to Canada, and we have forwarded him the best way we could. His sufferings have been great, his nature sickly." Activity on the Underground Railroad in Concord ramped up after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. Besides the Hillside, I know of at least 6 other homes in Concord that harbored fugitive slaves. And some of the people involved in this highly illegal activity were Abiel Haywood Wheeler, Henry Thoreau, Edmund Hosmer, Mary Merrick Brooks, Mary Rice, William Whiting, and Anne Bigelow. In an 1892 interview with Edward Emerson, Anne Bigelow said that Concord became more active in the Underground Railroad after 1850. And much like bigger towns and cities, Concord had its own vigilance committee to shepherd fugitives safely through town. The most famous fugitive slave to come through Concord was Shadrach Minkins. Minkins was the first fugitive to be captured in Boston after the passage of the new law. Many fugitives considered Boston a safe haven since it was the hotbed of anti-slavery sentiment. William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and Lewis Hayden all called Boston home, and it was a relatively safe place for fugitives to stay, at least until 1850. Minkins had escaped slavery in Virginia in early 1850 and was living in Boston as a free man and working at a coffee house on Beacon Hill. But in February 1851, he was seized by federal marshals under the auspices of the new Fugitive Slave Law. He was brought before a judge for initial hearing, and hundreds of people, black and white, gathered outside the Boston courthouse to protest his arrest. Several dozen men, mostly black, and including Lewis Hayden, rushed into the courthouse and bodily dragged Minkins outside and onto the streets, where they disappeared with him into Boston's West End and through the crowd. The next morning, in the pre-dawn hours of February 16th, 1851, Minkins found himself in the company of Lewis Hayden in Concord and at the home of Anne and Francis Bigelow on Sudbury Street, which is now across the street from the Concord Library. As Minkins rested, plans were made for Mr. Bigelow to take the fugitive to Leominster. From there, he would be taken through Vermont to the American-Canadian border, where he would cross over to Quebec and freedom. But while Minkins' rescue was a success for the Boston and Concord abolitionists, there were failures. Late in 1851, another fugitive, Thomas Sims, was captured in Boston and returned to his owner in Georgia. Minkins, of course, was by no means the only fugitive to come through Concord. And one has to wonder exactly how many runaways were helped by Concord's Vigilance Committee. While the exact number will never be known, Anne Bigelow would later remember that after 1850, quote, nearly every week some fugitive would be forwarded with the utmost secrecy to Concord to be harbored overnight, unquote. An estimated 300 fugitives came through Boston in the 1850s, and one wonders how many of them then came through Concord. The Thoreau family had long been involved in the anti-slavery movement. They were followers of William Lloyd Garrison, and they wholeheartedly believed in Garrison's motto, no union with slaveholders. They wanted nothing to do with a union so long as it continued to support slavery. This meant no voting and no paying of taxes. As Henry Thoreau would write in 1849, quote, I cannot consider it my government when it is the slave's government as well. The Thoreau family also supported another tenet of Garrisonianism, disunion. Throughout the 1840s, Cynthia and her daughters were involved with the call for the North to secede from the slaveholding South, which is treason, by the way. Therefore, it should be no surprise that the Thoreaus were involved with the Underground Railroad. In his book, Walden, Henry Thoreau even goes so far as to mention that he, quote, helped one real runaway slave forward toward the North Star while living at Walden Pond. The Thoreau family home on Main Street was also a stop on the Underground Railroad, and in October 1851, Henry would write a very detailed journal entry about a fugitive staying at their home. The man had been forwarded to Concord and the Thoreaus by William Lloyd Garrison. Thoreau would report that the, quote, intelligent and very well-behaved man lodged with us and waited in the house until funds were collected with which to forward him. I intended to dispatch him at noon through to Burlington, but when I went to buy his ticket, saw one at the depot who looked and behaved so much like a Boston policeman that I did not venture at that time period. So that last line reminds us of the danger of being involved with the Underground Railroad, not only for the runaways, but also for the so-called conductors. Thoreau and everyone else involved helping the fugitives were taking a tremendous chance by breaking the federal law. Another visit by a fugitive to the Thoreau home in July 1853 was well documented by a Harvard divinity student named Moncure Daniel Conway, who happened to be visiting Concord at the time. When he went over to the Thoreau house to take a walk with Henry, he would later remember, quote, in the morning, I found the Thoreaus agitated by the arrival of a colored fugitive from Virginia who had come to their door at daybreak. Thoreau took me to a room where his sister Sophia was ministering to the fugitive. I later observed the tender and lowly devotion of Henry Thoreau to the African. He now and then drew nearer to the trembling man and with a cheerful voice bade him feel at home and have no fear that any power should again wrong him. The whole day he mounted guard over the fugitive, for it was the slave hunting time period. But the guard had no weapon, and probably there was no such thing in the house. The next day, the fugitive was got off to Canada, and I enjoyed my first walk with Thoreau. So obviously, Thoreau was a regular participant in the Underground Railroad. Again, Anne Bigelow would remember that Thoreau, quote, more than any other man, helped nurse wounded or hurt runaways. He would also purchase railroad tickets for them and occasionally escort them to a train station and make sure that they were safe from slave catchers. Thoreau, indeed anyone who considered himself or herself an abolitionist, would again be up in arms a year later when on May 24th, 1854, another fugitive slave was arrested by federal marshals in Boston. Like Minkins, Anthony Burns was also a refugee from Virginia. But unlike Minkins, Burns would not be spirited safely away to Canada. Now, the Anthony Burns affair can be a lecture, a whole lecture unto itself. But for our purposes, it's safe to say that friends and associates of our Concord radicals, men like Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Theodore Parker, both Unitarian ministers, were involved in the attempt to rescue Burns from the slave catchers. Even Bronson Alcott, normally a pacifist, took part in the rescue effort, which turned violent and resulted in the death of a Boston courthouse guard. Sadly, Anthony Burns was returned to slavery. The abolitionists of Boston and Concord were incensed. In his journal, Emerson would write, "When the guards of personal liberty, writ of habeas corpus and the like are not used or not enforced for fear of bringing the state and federal courts into collision, when the United States Congress passes a law to stop the march of human civility and virtue by pre-establishing the barbarous institution of slavery, I submit that all government itself is treason, and you, the constituency, are swindled in the face of the world." Like Emerson, Henry Thoreau also put his anger and frustration over the Burns arrest into his journal. 2 months later, he put those entries into a lecture that he would give in an anti-slavery meeting in Framingham, Massachusetts on July 4th, 1854. William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Lucy Stone, and Sojourner Truth would all be on the rostrum that day to hear Thoreau read Slavery in Massachusetts. Here's one of my favorite paragraphs from that. "The judges and lawyers and all men of expediency try this case by a very low and incompetent standard. They consider not whether the Fugitive Slave Law is right, but whether it is what they call constitutional. Is virtue constitutional or vice? Is equity constitutional or inequity? In important moral and vital questions like this, it is just as impertinent to ask whether a law is constitutional or not as to ask whether it is profitable or not. They persist in being the servants of the worst of men and not the servants of humanity. The question is not whether you or your grandfather 70 years ago did not enter into an agreement to serve the devil, and that service is not accordingly now due, but whether you will not now for once and at last serve God in spite of your own past recreancy or that of your ancestor by obeying that eternal and only just constitution which he, and not any Jefferson or Adams, has written in your being." By 1855, it seemed as if the Union was indeed splitting apart because of slavery. The concern over the Fugitive Slave Law led to even greater concern over the fate of the country as armed warfare broke out in the Kansas Territory over whether or not Kansas would enter the Union as a slave or free state. By 1856, in a very real sense, the country was already at war with itself, civil war. And the Fugitive Slave Law was also, in a very real sense, one of the causes of that war. As I said earlier, rather than making things better, it polarized the country between North and South even more. The abolitionists in Concord and Boston and throughout the North were the first responders to the nightmare of slavery. Black and white, male and female, famous and obscure, these people pushed aside personal safety and risked their lives and reputations for a cause greater than themselves. Indeed, a cause that was greater than the Union itself. To them, breaking the Fugitive Slave Law was their duty because it was the right thing to do. As Henry Thoreau would write in Resistance to Civil Government, "Unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them, or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded, or shall we transgress them at once?" What they were doing, all of these people, they were transgressing an immoral law. Sadly, in 2020, Unjust laws and racial oppression still exist to this very day. I'm particularly haunted by the words of Lydia Emerson when she said, "Our national shame in standing on the neck of the enslaved Black man." And of course, that conjures up images of recent events in Minneapolis and elsewhere. Like the 19th century Concord abolitionists and transcendentalists, we must decide what's more important, following laws and executive actions that we disagree with, or standing on the side of justice and not injustice. It is our duty as American citizens to take a stand when government and leaders are immoral. It is a stand that the Concordians of 1850 would understand and support. I'll leave you with the words of Henry Thoreau from Slavery in Massachusetts, which I think are just as pertinent now as they were in 1854. Quote, "I wish my countrymen to consider that whatever the human law may be, neither an individual nor a nation can ever commit the least act of injustice against the obscurest individual without having to pay the penalty for it. A government which deliberately enacts injustice and persists in it will at length ever become the laughingstock of the world." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. I am just dumbstruck about how Concord transcendentalists had it right more than 100 years ago. And the similarities in the social justice that that's laid the groundwork for what groups are doing today, like Black Lives Matter and safe cities for undocumented workers. And it just seems that we're confronting these same issues today. So,
well, and I also, especially 3 or 4 years ago with the whole undocumented illegal situation at the border, it reminded me almost exactly of the Fugitive Slave Law. And one thing that we have to remember, though, that before 1850, abolitionists were definitely a minority here in the North. They were considered insane. They were considered troublemakers. But after 1850, as I mentioned in the lecture, a lot of people who probably did not think about anti-slavery or abolitionism at all suddenly were involved because we all became slave catchers. So I think that this fringe element of transcendentalists and abolitionists, their cause became more mainstream throughout the 1850s.
So Richard, we have a comment about religion and a question about religion. So I'll read the comment. It's from Brian. He writes, "Interesting how Thoreau, though hardly a Christian in slavery in Massachusetts and elsewhere, didn't hesitate to use the word devil for forces supporting the Fugitive Slave Law, and God for forces siding with the humanitarian, the compassionate, and the open-armed to other races." So that's, and then I'll read the question from Scott. To what extent, if any, did the New England churches participate in the abolitionist cause during this period, or was it primarily a secular movement?
It was primarily a secular movement. You know, all of the transcendentalists, almost all the transcendentalists had, at least the men, had been Unitarian ministers. But the Unitarian Church was a fairly conservative church in the 19th century, and a lot of ministers, not just Unitarian, kind of considered social issues none of their business. They were more concerned about getting people to heaven than how to take care of social causes. So most of these people would have considered themselves Christian. I'm talking about the abolitionists. A lot of them, like William Lloyd Garrison, believed it was the Christian thing to do to stand up against slavery. But he was looking at it in more of a secular Christian view, I guess is the best way to put it, as to actually getting any sort of dictates from a church or religious leaders or anything like that. Now, some of the Unitarian ministers like Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Theodore Parker, they were absolutely rabid abolitionists, and they were also a pain in the neck to the Unitarian hierarchy. They were very proud of the fact that the Unitarian hierarchy did not like the things that they were saying and doing when it came to transcendentalism or abolitionism. And both Higginson and Theodore Parker, at one time or another, were very proud of what they called preaching heresies about transcendentalism and anti-slavery. But yeah, although some of these people consider themselves Christian, I would say that it was mostly a secular movement.
This is a question that's been tossed around Thoreau Farm by visiting speakers on occasion. And there's been, so I don't know the answer, so that's why I'm going to ask you and put you on the spot. But
Okay.
did Thoreau believe in God?
He believed in lots of gods. You know, he talks about Krishna, he talks about Buddha. He says in A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers that he likes Jesus too. So, you know, I think that for him, it's that spark of divinity. You can call it what you want. You can call it Buddha or Christ or Krishna. Emerson called it the oversoul. At one time, Thoreau called it, I think, universal intelligence, but it's that spark of divinity that's in all of nature and all of mankind. So the transcendentalists have kind of gotten a bad rap that they were somehow a bunch of atheists. But as I said, almost all of them at one time or another had been Unitarian ministers or involved with the Unitarian Church. So there's definitely a spiritual underpinning. I've used that word twice tonight. A spiritual underpinning to transcendentalism, and there's a spiritual underpinning to some of the abolitionists as well.
Marjorie from Oregon commented, we'll give a shout out to her, commented about Concord's commitment to right action. You know, it began long ago, and it's, can you talk about the continued influence of Concord, of those 19th century transcendentalists, how they still influence what's going on today in terms of social justice?
Yeah, Concord still does radicalism really well, I think. In fact, I think it probably does radicalism. It's more widespread in Concord now than it was in the 1840s. You know, you can go out every Friday at the Rotary in the center of town. There are people who march around the Rotary with a big sign saying that they march for peace, which I think is pretty neat. Even just the other day, I saw some BLM people out in the Rotary with their signs. So I think that Concord still does social justice really well. The Unitarian Church, the First Parish Unitarian Universalist Church, is very much involved in social justice. I know that the Trinitarian Church is very much involved in social justice. Yeah, I think that it happens all over, but in Concord, we have this really great history of having all these amazing radical people living here, and that certainly helps the cause a lot. I'm happy to see that there are a lot of BLM signs in front yards as I drive through Concord and elsewhere. And so yeah, I think we have no choice. If we live in Concord, you have to be involved.
We have a practical question from Lauren. She wants to know, how did the society raise funds for the cause, or did they raise funds for the cause?
The Anti-Slavery Society?
Texas.
Well, the Female Anti-Slavery Society, like most anti-slavery societies in the North, they would have fundraisers. They would hold annual bazaars and anti-slavery fairs, and they would raise money that way. So, you know, we have these great stories about you would go to an anti-slavery fair and they would be selling things for you to buy. And so you could buy like a dozen quills and attached to the quills it would say "Weapons for the Abolitionists," because they spent a lot of time writing petitions and writing letters to people. So yeah, they would raise money not only for the anti-slavery efforts, but they would also raise money for the fugitive slaves as well. I mean, a lot of these people would pay for getting the fugitives to Canada out of their own pockets, but the Fugitive Slave Society or the anti-slavery societies did have funds to help runaways. And so they would usually raise money through fairs and bazaars and lectures and things like that.
We have a question from Anne, and she would like you to speak a bit about Black people who lived at Walden several years before Thoreau, and the attitude of most residents of Concord towards those people.
Well, yeah, and I should point out and say that Elise Lemire's book, Black Walden, is the best book to get if you want to know a lot about the Black presence in Concord and Walden in the 17th and 18th and early 19th centuries. But yeah, Walden Pond itself, which you can see up behind me here, was always kind of on the fringe of society, and it was an area where the unwanted people tended to live, primarily African Americans, and also by the 19th century, a lot of the Irish lived out here as well. And also living on the fringe of society proudly was Henry Thoreau for a couple of years. The Black presence in Concord was honestly pretty small throughout the 18th and 19th century. I think in the 1860 census of Concord, out of 2,000 people, only a couple of dozen people of color were counted. So it was always a fairly small percentage of the population. And they were really on the fringe of society because they lived out here at Walden Pond or not in the center of town. Of course, the Robbins House over by the North Bridge was a home owned by a free Black family. So they were here, but they were definitely in the minority throughout the 19th century.
This is from Eric. Thoreau often had mixed feelings about famous people, even if their politics or aesthetics were more or less in accordance with his. For example, Emerson. I wonder if there's a record of what Thoreau felt about Garrison and Phillips and Parker personally, even they were abolitionists.
Thoreau had a problem with a lot of reformers because he thought a lot of reformers were doing it just to line their own pockets. And he could see through that pretty easily. He considered some of the reformers to be self-serving and pretentious, and he thought that they really didn't have their hearts in the right place. He felt differently about William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips and Theodore Parker and Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He knew that those men walked the walk and talked the talk. And they were putting their whole lives and reputations at stake in the anti-slavery battle. So he was friends with Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He certainly admired Theodore Parker, and he admired Garrison and Wendell Phillips as well. Garrison had a really great relationship with the entire Thoreau family. And when Thoreau read Slavery in Massachusetts at the anti-slavery rally on July 4th, 1854, he wasn't in the pre-rally publications or the PR before it happened. We think maybe Garrison personally invited him to come to the rally and read Slavery in Massachusetts. So Garrison had a pretty warm relationship with the entire Thoreau family. And I think that although Thoreau never really says anything about Garrison, I'm pretty sure, I hate saying this because who knows, but I think that he certainly admired Garrison because Garrison spent his whole life in the anti-slavery cause.
Hey, there's a lot of questions here. People want to pick your brains. Carolyn wants, if you could share some good resources on Bronson Alcott's abolitionist views, journals, books.
His journals are a great place to start. I'm not sure how many of them are available. At one time, there were selections that were published like back in the 40s or 50s. You might still be able to find those maybe on eBay or Amazon. John Madison's book, Eden's Outcasts, is a wonderful biography of both Bronson and Louisa. Goes into really great detail about their anti-slavery views. Another great book, which I just happen to have here, is Sandy Petrolinos's book, To Set This World Right, The Anti-Slavery Movement in Thoreau's Concord, one of my Bibles. And there's a lot in there about not only the Alcotts, but all the other people that we've talked about. So those are probably, that and John Madison's book are probably the two best if you want to find out anything about the Alcotts.
Andy has a question about the conductors. While the Underground Railroad conductors were risking arrest, how much risk did they actually have? Were many prosecuted, or was there ever a concerted effort to break up the network?
It depends on what state you live in. I'm from Ohio originally, and it was easier for slave catchers and federal marshals to get to Ohio because they just had to cross the Ohio River from Kentucky. So I know that the so-called conductors there faced a lot of issues and got into trouble, and some were arrested, and I think maybe some were even killed. We were a little bit more safe up here in Massachusetts because we're far from the Mason-Dixon line. Anybody helping fugitive slaves in a town like Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which is very close to the Mason-Dixon line, they were running into some serious issues. So because we're up here, and really Shadrach Minkins, Thomas Sims, and Anthony Burns, those are really the only three celebrated cases of fugitives being arrested by slave catchers because of the Fugitive Slave Law. So that's three compared to hundreds that actually made it through. So I don't think the slave catchers or the conductors up here in Massachusetts were particularly in danger, but there was always the possibility that it could happen. So I know that they were always looking over their shoulders.
Matt from Austin asks, I've heard that women in particular were ardent abolitionists. Is this because they too knew they were property? And Matt thanks you, and he enjoys the talk. But along with that, after you answer that, I wonder if you could talk about how the abolitionists helped frame the suffrage movement.
Sure. Well, William Lloyd Garrison himself said that women were the backbone of the anti-slavery movement. So, and he knew that without them, there wouldn't have been really an anti-slavery movement. So yeah, you cannot really say enough about the women's involvement in the anti-slavery movement. Now, after the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment, when slavery is abolished, a lot of the women that had been abolitionists then took their passion and moved forward and became suffragists. Lucy Stone is a perfect example of that. Sojourner Truth. They both kind of continued the battle for equal rights. They went from the slave to the women, to many of the women. Comparing women's lives to the lives of slaves was pretty much the same thing. So it was not that big of a step for them to move from fighting against slavery to fighting for equal rights for women. Even some of the men, Thomas Wentworth Higginson became an avid suffragist and did a lot for women's rights throughout the last half of the 19th century. But yeah, I think what the women learned in the anti-slavery battle, they took with them into the equal rights battle after the Civil War.
So this is the one last question, and then we have to do a little bit of housekeeping. Catherine has asked you to comment on something, and I think this is like a test to see how short you can keep this comment. She wants to know if you can comment on the relationship between John Brown and Thoreau.
Let me think. Yes, of course, Thoreau absolutely adored John Brown. John Brown came to Concord twice, 1857 and 1859. Thoreau and others like the Alcotts and Emerson considered him a freedom fighter, and they were happy to see somebody doing something directly to end slavery instead of writing letters and not buying cotton. And of course, Thoreau was the first person in the country to speak out publicly in favor of John Brown after the raid on Harper's Ferry in his plea for Captain John Brown. So yes, they had a relationship in terms of Thoreau absolutely supported John Brown to the day that he died and beyond. How was that? That was only like a minute and a half, right?
Well, I'm teasing Richard because he gave a talk last year around this time on John Brown, and it was very riveting and insightful. As is tonight's talk. I want to thank you, Richard, so much. Do you have any of your books that we could show?
I do. I have them here. So I've written 5 books for Applewood Books. I've written a 6th one, but it's still being produced. I'm not sure when that'll come out. But I have written and edited quotations of Henry David Thoreau, quotations of John Muir, a short biography of Henry David Thoreau, and a short biography of John Muir. I've also done a short biography of Alexander Hamilton. And these 4 are available here, shop@waldenpond.org. All of them are available at applewoodbooks.com.
Now, many of the panelists have asked if this talk, if they could have a printed copy of the talk, and if it's okay with you, we could post it on our blog, The Roost.
Yeah, I did a lot of editing since the one that I sent to you. Let me go, I'll go through the next couple of days. I'll add the stuff that I didn't have in originally, and then I'll send you the file, and feel free to post it if you want.
Okay, so it'll be check back in maybe 4 or 5 days to throwfarm.org, and you'll read our blog called The Roost. Also, one last bit, and why we're passing the hat. So while you're at throwfarm.org, if you would like to donate, that would be great. And every gift is greatly appreciated. And also, you can volunteer, you can write for the blog, you can help us with social media by retweeting and sharing things. All that helps Thoreau Farm keep going. So thank you all for attending tonight. And once again, Richard.
And thank you to everybody. Thank you to everybody that joined in. I'm really honored and happy that you decided to spend your Friday night with me. Thank you for joining in, and thank you, Margaret. This was really fun. And we'll have this link to this talk up in a couple of days at throwfarm.org and also at the Thoreau Society .org Facebook pages. So people will be able to view it and share it. So thank you again. Good night.